It was a big fancy party at the Plaza Hotel on a Thursday night. Everyone who was anyone in the world of big money was there. Wendy Hayes, beautiful and dressed to kill, a sharp black woman who could run circles around most of the men in the room, stood right next to her husband, Gregory, near the bar. The rich men were talking about complicated stuff, the kind of things that make millions of dollars move overnight. Wendy, who didn't just understand the game, but who mastered it, piped up to correct a detail about the markets. But Gregory hated that. He grabbed her arm tight, his face twisting meanly. "Honey, stop!" he snapped, loud enough for folks to hear. That's just plain stupid. You're totally wrong." Every head in the room snapped around. People started lifting up their phones, recording the whole ugly scene, buzzing like flies. Gregory, feeling his power swell, just laughed that fake, dismissive laugh. "My wife doesn't actually work in finance, folks," he sneered, looking around for approval. "She doesn't understand any of this." First, there was dead silence, the kind that hurts your ears. Then, the nervous little snickers started up, followed by the cruel, quick whispers. Not a single soul stepped up to help Wendy. They just watched her burn. Gregory, acting like she was a nuisance he had just wiped off his shoe, turned his back on her and went right back to talking to the rich men. He was done with her, right there in front of God and everybody. He didn't know it then, but in just 12 hours, he'd be crawling on his knees, begging for forgiveness. The sharp, black wife he just called stupid? She was about to destroy every single thing he thought he owned. The whole tragedy started 8 years before, down in Miami at a big industry meeting. Wendy Anderson was a superstar, brilliant and rising fast, managing money for the heavy hitters. Gregory Hayes was already the king of his own castle, the big boss of Hayes Capital Group, a real-deal billionaire. $1.4 billion. Certified. He chased her hard, relentless in his pursuit. He was charming, confident, acted like she was the only woman in the world until he got her. They got married in 2016. The air inside the Hayes penthouse, suspended 40 stories above the hum of Central Park, had curdled overnight. When Wendy finally stepped out of the Blacktown car at 5 past midnight, after leaving the gala early, citing a sudden necessary portfolio stress test that Gregory was too drunk to question, the quiet of their home was deceptive. It was the quiet before a financial panic, a familiar, taut vacuum that usually preceded mass redemptions. She walked straight past the enormous, tasteless gold clock Gregory had insisted on, avoiding the bedroom where he was surely snoring off the insult of the evening, and retreated to her home office. The office, unlike the rest of the apartment, was stripped down, functional, and organized with a terrifying precision. On her dedicated work phone, the one Gregory dismissed as her toy for playing manager, the notifications were already stacking up. The short, 12-second clip was everywhere. Twitter, LinkedIn, Bloomberg terminals. The video quality was poor, shaky, clearly shot covertly by a bystander's phone, but the audio was crystalline. Gregory's patrician voice, dripping with contempt, slicing through the polite buzz of the high-finance gala. "Honey, stop. That's stupid. You're wrong. My wife doesn't work in finance. She doesn't understand this." The clip was packaged under various, immediate titles. Hayes Stupid, Billionaire Boss Mansplains, and, most cuttingly, Financial Facts Fail. Wendy watched it once, clinically, noting the precise angle of the camera that captured the flicker of malice in Gregory's eyes just before he dismissed her. There was no emotion in her chest, only the cool, detached assessment of a strategist watching an enemy make the inevitable, fatal mistake. The past 8 years had been the slow, systematic buildup of data points. This was the final, irrefutable entry. She picked up the landline, dialing an unlisted number reserved only for the most urgent legal counsel. "Linda, it's Wendy. Check your email." Subject line: leverage. The conversation lasted exactly 90 seconds. No pleasantries, no emotional review of the night. Linda Bennett, Wendy's divorce attorney and a veteran of high-stakes splits, understood that the time for empathy was over. The time for execution had begun. "The viral component," Linda's voice crackled, low and gravelly, "changes the timeline. We can accelerate. You still comfortable with the full disclosure?" "Absolutely," Wendy confirmed, her voice perfectly even. "His contempt is public now. My dignity is the only thing left that is purely mine. Release the first tranche." Teeth. This was the parallel action that Gregory remained utterly ignorant of. While he lay anesthetized by champagne and entitlement, Wendy was already distributing the first phase of the plan, the controlled, documented release of the facts that would dismantle his reputation, brick by inherited brick. Gregory woke to the sound of frantic whispering and the jarring, repetitive chime of his personal phone demanding attention. It was 7 a.m. Face-safes. Friday morning, and the damage was already catastrophic. He stumbled out of bed, grabbing the silk robe tossed carelessly over the chaise lounge. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window showed a man who looked less like a formidable CEO and more like a privileged child whose favorite toy had been snatched. His face was pale, his eyes still bloodshot from the alcohol, but the flush that rose when he saw the trending topics was pure, indignant rage. "Where is Wendy?" he roared, stomping into the kitchen where their high-level executive assistant, Peter, was already hovering, looking terrified and sweating profusely in his perfectly tailored suit. "Mrs. Hayes left early, sir. She said she had an urgent call with the Hong Kong office," Peter stammered, holding a tablet displaying the worst of the comments. Gregory snatched the tablet, scrolling through the replies. He didn't read them so much as he felt them as a physical violation. Financial genius Gregory Hayes confirms his wife is a moron. What does he know that the Fed doesn't? Imagine inheriting $1 billion and still being jealous of your wife's IQ. Sakurf Hayes, stupid. He threw the tablet onto the marble island. "This is ridiculous. It's 12 seconds of tape. She provoked me. She was trying to show off in front of the Silverstein crowd. I need to control this narrative. Get CNBC on the line. I need to go live. Immediately. We need to frame this as a minor marital misunderstanding. Stress the stress of the market. The pressures of the role. I'm going to apologize to my beautiful, supportive wife." The behavioral emotion was clear. Gregory wasn't seeking true forgiveness. He was seeking narrative control. His arrogance demanded that the public accept his explanation of the events, regardless of reality. He believed his status was immune to the facts captured on a low-resolution phone. Within the hour, the machinery of Hayes Capital was mobilized not to address the toxic company culture the incident hinted at, but to stage a spectacular performance of domestic contrition. Meanwhile, in her dedicated office, Wendy had closed the 90-second conversation with Linda and initiated a new one with Jasmine, her sister. This was the underlying dialogue, the coded communication that bypassed the need for lengthy emotional explanation. "The timing is set," Wendy stated, running a precise fingernail down a page filled with neatly handwritten figures. "And the collateral?" Jasmine asked. She knew the terminology. Collateral meant the human cost, the emotional fallout. Managed. They are safe. School drop-off was normal. No interaction needed, Wendy replied, referring to their 2 young children. "Good. He's going live, you know, on the business channels. He's trying to put out the fire with gasoline." Wendy smiled, a small, cold curve of her lips. "Of course he is. He must remind everyone he's the owner of the house, even when it's burning down around him. Send Sarah Collins the second set of documents. Tell her she has a hard deadline of 5 p.m. today for confirmation. Everything needs to align with his airtime. The parallel action was now perfectly synchronized. Gregory was about to step onto the public stage to perform his vulnerability, and Wendy was ensuring that the spotlight would immediately shift from his performance to her irrefutable financial facts. At 10:30 a.m., Gregory Hayes sat in the polished glass-walled studio of CNBC, looking every inch the regretful titan. The anchor, a familiar, smooth-talking man named Marcus, offered a softball opening. "Gregory, thank you for coming on so quickly." Obviously, there's a lot of conversation this morning surrounding the short clip from last night's gala. It was a stressful environment. Can you clarify the situation for our viewers? Gregory nodded gravely, leaning into the camera with practiced sincerity. Marcus, thank you. Absolutely. I must say, I am deeply regretful. Last night, I was under immense pressure regarding the impending regulatory changes, and I took that stress out on the person I love most in the world, my brilliant wife, Wendy. She is, by far, the sharpest person I know. I owe her a public apology for my lapse in judgment. He paused, waiting for the camera to hold his gaze, trying to project the behavioral emotion of contrition. But, let's be honest, Wendy is not currently active in the day-to-day operations of managing capital. She's focused on the children, primarily, and some advisory roles. When she mentioned the yield curve, she was simply mistaken on the technical implementation. I reacted poorly, yes, but the fact remains. Finance is high stakes, and she simply doesn't have the operational background anymore to truly understand the nuances of the Fed's latest actions. She's a wonderful mother, a wonderful partner, but I simply need her to trust my experience in the field that bears my family name. The moment the words left his mouth, a collective gasp seemed to echo across the financial districts. He hadn't just apologized, he had qualified, dismissed, and re-insulted her, all under the guise of protecting her from the nuances she couldn't possibly grasp. He had reiterated the central thesis of the viral clip, that she was incompetent, just a mother, just his wife, not a real player. Marcus, the anchor, tried to recover, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. So, you're suggesting the stress caused you to perhaps mischaracterize her role, not necessarily her fundamental competence? She is extremely competent in many areas, Gregory insisted, missing the nuance entirely, his internal panic making his tone defensive. But look, I'm the CEO of Hayes Capital. I'm the one responsible for the multi-billion-dollar portfolios. That's the reality of our dynamic. I just want the public to understand that sometimes men lose their temper when their professional authority is challenged in public, especially by someone who doesn't fully. He stopped short, catching the frozen, horrified expression of his PR liaison visible just off camera. He had gone too far, again. The fragile attempt at damage control had combusted into an aggressive doubling down. Across town, Wendy watched the broadcast in silence. The contrasting description was stark. Gregory, flushed and aggressively defensive in high definition. Wendy, composed and cool in the quiet shadows of her office. He had just handed her everything she needed to launch the final attack. His refusal to simply apologize, his absolute need to assert his superior authority, was a devastating gift. Her phone rang. It was Sarah Collins, the sharp investigative journalist at Bloomberg. I just saw it, Wendy. Unbelievable. He simply cannot help himself. Sarah's voice was tense, laced with professional excitement. We have your employment data ready. Compensation reports, AUM statements, everything notarized. I want to publish tonight, after market close. The headline is powerful. We need to make sure the legal team is ready for the immediate defamation lawsuit he's going to file. We are ready, Sarah, Wendy confirmed. File it at 4:01 p.m. Eastern. exactly 1 minute after the closing bell. The story needs to be about competence, not custody. The income disclosure needs to be the lead. Wendy leaned back, her hands clasped on the polished surface of her desk. She knew the facts they were about to publish. Her annual income of $2.4 million, 3 times Gregory's CEO salary, and her $4.8 billion in assets under management would not just embarrass him, they would eviscerate the entire basis of his professional authority and his marital dominance. He called her stupid. Now she would show the world, with cold, irrefutable numbers, precisely who was superior and who was merely coasting on the inertia of inherited wealth. But there was a sudden, sharp vibration from the phone on her desk. It was an alert from her security system, a notification regarding the remote access logs. She frowned. The log indicated a successful login attempt to her primary personal email address, the one she used for communication with the children's school, and critically, the one she had inadvertently used years ago to store the first few highly sensitive documents related to her initial exit planning. The login attempt was registered 5 minutes ago. The source IP address was located within the Hayes Capital Data Center downtown. Gregory's security team had found the hole. Her breathing hitched, the first involuntary physical reaction since the night before. This was not a professional move. This was a personal violation, a desperate, preemptive strike by a man realizing he was losing control. If he accessed the early drafts of her exit plan, he wouldn't just see the divorce. He would see the 8 years of methodical deception, the careful documentation, the calculated withdrawal of emotional and financial commitment. The publication of the financial facts was minutes away. But now Gregory might have the counterintelligence to discredit her before the truth could land. Wendy gripped the edge of the desk. She needed to contact Linda immediately, not just about the imminent publication, but about the threat that her estranged husband had just successfully breached her digital defenses, potentially exposing sensitive information that could compromise the legal and professional sequence she had spent 8 years building. The clock was ticking, and the race to control the narrative had just escalated from a professional dispute to a hostile digital confrontation with severe consequences. This required an immediate tactical response. The clock face of the desktop terminal became a silent, blinding countdown. Wendy did not hear the ringtone as she snatched the work phone. She only registered the metallic taste of adrenaline. The 8 years she had spent building her financial castle now felt predicated on sand, threatened by a single malicious digital tide. Gregory wasn't playing the game of separation. He was enacting scorched earth, aiming not just for her assets, but for the moral foundation of her professional narrative. Linda, it's Wendy. He's in. He breached the network. The private drafts? Linda Bennett's voice, usually a smooth, calming current, was suddenly ragged, a river hitting rocks. I know, Wendy, but that's secondary right now. Listen to me. Gregory's counsel just filed an emergency motion. It dropped 5 minutes ago. He's moving to seal the records of Dr. Ross. Wendy's grip tightened around the receiver until the plastic creaked, her knuckles white shadows beneath her skin. This was the complication, sharper and more surgical than she had feared. Gregory had not focused on the raw dollar figures, which were irrefutable. He had targeted the documented why. Seal them? On what grounds? Wendy forced the words out, each syllable requiring a separate, arduous act of will. The impending publication of her AUM and compensation suddenly felt thin, a brilliant but insufficient shield if the true story, the psychological captivity she endured, was silenced. Marital privilege. Worse, he's leveraging something in the early drafts you mentioned, claiming that because he saw your intention to use them, the documents were tainted. He's alleging bad faith and selective disclosure. He's trying to invalidate Dr. Ross's entire file, preemptively calling it fabricated evidence intended to extort him. Linda's intake of breath was sharp. The judge is considering an ex parte order for a temporary seal pending review. If this happens, Wendy, we lose the clinical proof of his pattern. The board members might tolerate an arrogant buffoon, but they react differently to a documented abuser. That's the distinction he's trying to erase. A sharp, electric shock ran through Wendy. The financial facts were artillery. The counseling records were the internal map of the battlefield. If Gregory could frame the 8 years of emotional endurance as merely legal maneuvering by a greedy wife, the public narrative, the momentum she needed, would fracture. He wasn't just controlling the damage. He was trying to repaint the entire timeline, transforming his systematic cruelty into her ruthless calculation. Her inner conflict flared, brief and intense. She had always prioritized dignity, the silent, meticulous buildup of facts. But dignity was a luxury now. Gregory had proven that his wealth, inherited and arrogant, allowed him to move faster in the legal theater than the truth could move in the public square. Do I fight this legally, risking time, or do I sacrifice the clinical detail and rely solely on the financial data? The idea of letting Gregory successfully suppress the 8 years of recorded emotional violence felt like a deep, personal betrayal of the younger woman who had suffered silently. The records were not just evidence. They were the ghost limb of her pain, finally given voice. We cannot let him seal them, Linda. Not today, Wendy stated, her voice lowering to the tone she used when commanding multi-million-dollar trades, precise, cold, absolute. He moved quickly, but he moved with panic. He is focused on the document's existence, not its content. We shift the timeline. Shift it how? We have an hour before Bloomberg publishes, and we need to respond to this filing, or we lose the evidence before we can even introduce it. Third, Wendy walked swiftly to the window overlooking the city, which was now a canyon of indifferent glass and steel. She felt the pressure of the hostile digital confrontation wrapping around her like cold wire. We don't respond to the motion. We make the motion moot, Wendy said, projecting every ounce of suppressed emotion into strategy. The records are scheduled for delivery to Sarah Collins at Bloomberg after the financial report drops. Change the timeline. I need you to prepare a statement right now for immediate release to Collins and the relevant court clerk. Not a full legal disclosure, but a factual confirmation. A confirmation of what? What are we confirming? Linda asked, confusion evident in the interrupted dialogue. Confirming that the Hayes marital counselor, Dr. Helen Ross, has provided me with documentation confirming the established pattern of emotional and psychological abuse during the 8-year duration of the marriage, Wendy commanded. Do not quote the contents. Do not attach the records. Just confirm the existence of the documented pattern and the clinician's identity. If he is attempting to seal the records due to alleged taint, we make the fact of their existence public immediately. The court can seal the documents, Linda, but they cannot seal the news cycle. Gregory's lawyers are trying to silence Dr. Ross. We force them to explain why a CEO is terrified of a clinician's notes being acknowledged. The silence on Linda's end stretched taut, the sound of her rapid analysis almost audible. It's dangerous. It risks contempt if the court rules against us on the sealing order, Linda warned. It's already dangerous. He is already trying to label the truth an extortion attempt, Wendy countered, determination hardening her resolve. Execute the statement, Linda. Frame it not as an accusation, but as clarification for the Hayes Capital Board, who, as fiduciaries, deserve to know the full context of their CEO's actions, beyond his dismissive CNBC interview. This is not about the divorce, Linda. This is about professional integrity and the systemic abuse of power. Let him fight the fact that the pattern exists. We will introduce the evidence later. Right now, we must ensure his panic does not succeed in turning my pain invisible." Wendy hung up the phone. The metaphorical invasion had forced her hand. She had planned to introduce the emotional trauma only after her financial independence was solidified, allowing the facts of her career to speak first. Gregory's preemptive strike had changed the sequencing. Now, the battle was not just about the money she earned or the respect she deserved. It was a brutal, public race against silence itself. She walked back to her desk, her gaze fixed on the screen where the Bloomberg ticker would soon change everything. She was exposed, yes, but exposure meant she had nothing left to lose but the fight itself. And Wendy Hayes was done losing. The moment Wendy hung up the phone with Linda Bennett, the silence in her secure downtown office felt less like peace and more like the tense quiet before a shockwave hits. She did not return immediately to the Bloomberg ticker. Instead, she crossed the room to the heavy, insulated window overlooking the ceaseless surge of Manhattan traffic. Below, the city was a million disconnected narratives, but she was about to force them all to focus on one single, uncomfortable truth. Her phone began its frantic vibration sequence, a dull, insistent drumming against the mahogany desk, escalating from an isolated buzz to a continuous thrum within 30 seconds. Linda had executed the statement. The first ripple was a sharp, clinical press release from Linda's firm. Clarification of CEO Hayes' pattern of professional disparagement and misuse of corporate influence to undermine professional equals. The language was impeccably dry, avoiding words like abuse or victim, focusing instead on fiduciary duty, workplace environment, and the documented pattern of psychological manipulation spanning 8 years, which Hayes Capital's board members, as stewards of the firm's integrity, needed to evaluate. It did not mention the divorce. It only mentioned the facts. The immediate explosion on financial news networks was deafening. The initial shock following the income revelation had centered on the quantitative facts. She earned more. Her AUM was larger. This new revelation, however, introduced the qualitative horror. It provided the why behind Gregory's panicked, contemptuous reaction at the gala. It explained why a man with an estimated net worth of $1.4 billion felt the pathological need to publicly degrade his wife. The narrative shift was immediate and brutal. Gregory Hayes had initially been painted as merely arrogant. Now he was cast as a systemic bully, whose control issues stemmed from deep, professional insecurity. Wendy sat down, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the encrypted email Linda had forwarded. It contained the initial media reaction summary and, more critically, the first legal documents filed by Gregory's team. They were moving with astonishing speed. The counteroffensive. Within 2 hours of the release, Gregory's high-powered legal defense, led by the infamous Manhattan litigator Thaddeus Thorne, a man known for his scorched earth tactics, had filed 4 separate motions: an emergency motion to seal all future divorce proceedings, citing irreparable reputational harm to Gregory and the children; an injunction against Dr. Helen Ross, claiming violation of medical privacy and breach of professional ethics; a cease and desist against 2 former Hayes Capital employees who had anonymously confirmed the pattern; and, most aggressively, a demand for Wendy's immediate in-person deposition within 24 hours. Linda called, her voice tight with professional anxiety. "They are trying to flood the channels, Wendy. They are attempting to paint us as reckless, using confidential professional records to extort a favorable settlement. Thorne's strategy is simple: intimidate the third parties until they withdraw their statements, thus isolating your claim." "They are going after Dr. Ross?" Wendy asked, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Dr. Ross, the ethical professional who had meticulously documented Gregory's cycles of gaslighting and public undermining, was Wendy's key to establishing the pattern. If Thorne could discredit her, the narrative would crumble back into a he said, she said divorce drama. They are trying to revoke her license. They are leveraging the non-disclosure agreements signed by the two former employees, Michael and Jenna, who spoke off the record to Sarah Collins. Michael is now at Citadel, and Thorne is threatening his current employment contract. This was the complication Wendy had both feared and anticipated. Her fight was now endangering those who had placed their trust in her ability to win. She felt the fierce, protective heat of obligation rise above her own fear. The financial documents, the 3-year plan, the 4.8 billion AUM. None of that mattered if she allowed the collateral damage to ruin innocent people. "We need to shield them, Linda," Wendy stated, the words clipped and definite. "Michael and Jenna trusted us. Dr. Ross acted ethically. Thorne wants to eliminate the corroboration. We cannot let him. Shielding them means filing extensive counter-motions, which takes time. Time we don't have before the board meets next week, and time Gregory is using to try and regain the narrative," Linda explained. "He's claiming this is a vendetta, that you are emotionally unstable and using professional resources for personal revenge. The insult, the suggestion that 8 years of calculated self-defense was mere instability, stung Wendy deeply, touching the vulnerability she fought so hard to conceal. Then we buy them time," Wendy decided, her gaze focused on a framed photograph of her children, a reminder of the true stakes. "Thorne demanded my deposition in 24 hours, correct?" "Yes. A rushed, aggressive interview designed to break your composure before the board votes." "Accept it," Wendy said, the decision requiring a deep, visceral commitment. "I will take the deposition tomorrow morning. It will be the sacrifice. It will absorb Thorne's immediate focus and time, forcing him to spend 12 hours trying to discredit me personally, instead of focusing his energy on intimidating Dr. Ross or threatening Michael's job. While I am under fire, you use that time to file the necessary protective motions for them." Linda paused, the silence stretching across the line. "Wendy, Thorne is vicious. He will bring up every perceived fault, every counseling session, every moment of weakness Gregory manufactured, and he will twist it into evidence of instability. He is looking for one single emotional break, one tear, one moment of professional lapse that he can use to discredit everything." "Are you absolutely certain?" "I have spent 8 years learning to internalize and compartmentalize the things Gregory said to me. I have documented everything he did, not just for the lawyers, but for my own survival. I am not emotionally unstable, Linda. I am meticulously prepared," Wendy asserted, though the truth was that the thought of facing Thorne's pointed malice made the muscles in her neck tighten painfully. The alternative is letting Michael lose his career and allowing Gregory to destroy the integrity of a professional counselor who simply kept clinical records. That is not an acceptable cost of victory. Schedule the deposition. 10 a.m. tomorrow. The preparation. Reviewing the trauma. The next 12 hours were a blur of intense surgical preparation. Wendy canceled everything, locking herself away with Linda and an associate in a sterile conference room in her firm's headquarters. A neutral, professional space she felt she could control. Linda's associate, a young woman with sharp eyes and a silent demeanor, projected the core evidence onto a white screen. The digitized records from Dr. Ross. These were not just notes. They were transcripts of sessions, dated and time-stamped, detailing Gregory's systematic approach to control. They read the clinical description of Gregory's tactic, the pattern of diminishment. "Look here, Wendy," Linda instructed, pointing to a session entry from 2019. Patient H reports husband G intercepted a critical email regarding the Singapore project, informing her team she was too distracted to handle the logistics. He took control of my workflow in my own company, Wendy muttered, the memory cold and sharp. He did it casually, always cloaked in the guise of helping me, but his goal was always the same, ensuring I never felt fully competent without his approval. They scrolled through a dozen instances. The time Gregory insisted she take a specific low-level course at Wharton, only to tell her afterward, in front of friends, "See, now you almost know as much as I learned by osmosis." See, the constant correction of her professional terminology in private, telling her she sounded too aggressive or too technical for a woman. The endless, tiny pinpricks of contempt. "The key is this," Linda explained, circling a section in the document where Dr. Ross summarized the impact. The patient exhibits classic symptoms of professional isolation and self-censorship, leading to a calculated decision to suppress demonstrable expertise in social settings to avoid spousal conflict. "This explains the GALA," Wendy said, the words quiet. "I knew what the yield curve was doing. I had just traded off of that information. But when he called me stupid, my first instantaneous reaction was 8 years of training telling me to pull back, to agree, to disappear. The video shows my face frozen in compliance, not in ignorance." The emotional weight of reviewing the documented trauma was an agonizing experience, a deliberate sacrifice of silent dignity. Every page turned was a fresh sting, a reminder of the emotional capital she had spent trying to manage his ego and protect her peace. She realized that the greatest effort she had to exert now was not financial calculation, but emotional regulation. She had to transform her deepest wounds into the most controlled professional evidence. She spent 2 hours drilling with Linda, running through the potential lines of attack Thorne would use. "He will ask if you feel unhappy or vengeful." "Cheat, how do you respond?" Linda challenged. "My current emotional state is irrelevant to the documented facts of a pattern of professional interference and abuse of fiduciary power," Wendy recited, her voice steady, emotionless. "He will ask if the financial revelations are an attempt to publicly humiliate Gregory Hayes. The financial reports are matters of public record, verified by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and were released by a third party. They demonstrate my verifiable professional competence, which contrasts sharply with the documented pattern of disparagement by Mr. Hayes. He will try to bait you with the children. He will suggest this public battle is damaging them." This was the hardest test. Wendy paused, taking a slow breath, tasting the sterile air of the conference room. "My priority has always been the physical and emotional safety of my children. Removing them from a consistently abusive environment is the definition of professional parental responsibility." She did not allow her voice to crack. She did not allow a single tear to fall. She channeled the intense, protective rage, not into a volatile eruption, but into a crystalline shell of control. If Thorne wanted to accuse her of instability, she would present the most stable, unassailable witness he had ever encountered. By 3 a.m., the conference room smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. Wendy stood up, flexing muscles she didn't realize were coiled. She felt emptied, stripped down to raw determination, but ready. The deposition chamber. The next morning, the environment was designed to be suffocating. The deposition took place not in Linda's office, but in a neutral, windowless legal annex downtown. The room was small, too warm, dominated by a long, polished table and the presence of Thaddeus Thorne, who radiated entitlement and cold, analytical malice. Thorne was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a custom dark suit that seemed designed to absorb light. He was flanked by a junior associate and a court reporter whose fingers hovered nervously over the stenography machine. Gregory was not present, which was Thorne's design. Absence emphasized the formality of the legal proceeding, reducing Wendy's testimony to a mere formality that Thorne was professionally dismantling. Wendy sat across the table from him, Linda at her side. Wendy was wearing a simple, dark blue suit, professional armor. She avoided eye contact with Thorne, focusing instead on the neutral space just above the reporter's head. The tension in the room was palpable, smelling faintly of old paper and anxiety. Wendy felt the full weight of the extraordinary effort she was undertaking. She was willingly exposing her most private pain to the judgment of a hostile interrogator to protect her allies and secure the truth. Thorne began with an introductory statement that sounded less like a legal preamble and more like a thinly veiled threat. "Mrs. Hayes, thank you for agreeing to this expedited process. I want to be perfectly clear. We view the recent media circus surrounding your divorce, specifically the unsolicited release of private therapeutic records and anonymous employee testimonies, as a calculated act of professional sabotage designed to extort a settlement far beyond reasonable spousal support limits." "That is noted," Wendy replied calmly. Thorne smiled, a cold, practiced gesture that did not reach his eyes. "Let's begin, then, with the concept of professional integrity. You, Mrs. Hayes, are a portfolio manager. A very successful one, we have been told. Yet, your current actions suggest a profound lack of regard for ethical boundaries, leveraging privileged communication, your own marriage counselor's files, for financial gain. Is that not a fair assessment of what we are witnessing?" Linda leaned forward, ready to object, but Wendy held up a hand slightly, stopping her. "No, Mr. Thorne, that is not a fair assessment," Wendy replied, her voice steady and clear, without a flicker of anger or defensiveness. "The release of non-privileged factual statements regarding the professional conduct of Mr. Hayes was necessary to provide context to the board of directors of Hayes Capital, who are fiduciaries of the firm's reputation and financial health. The systematic pattern of psychological abuse, which began with professional disparagement in the workplace and extended into the marriage, is relevant to his fitness to lead." Thorne steepled his fingers, leaning back slightly, attempting to convey boredom and intellectual superiority. "Fitness to lead. That sounds like jargon. Let us talk about facts, Mrs. Hayes. Specifically, the fact that you, a highly compensated professional, chose to remain in this allegedly abusive marriage for 8 years. Why, if the environment was so corrosive, did you not leave sooner? Was it perhaps because your financial dependence on Mr. Hayes was greater than you now claim? This was the core challenge, attacking her agency, turning her methodical exit plan into evidence of complicity or manipulation. I remained for 2 reasons, Mr. Thorne. First, because I was systematically conditioned over 8 years to believe that my competence and safety were dependent upon maintaining the structure Mr. Hayes controlled. Second, and most importantly, I spent 3 years executing a complex financial strategy at significant personal sacrifice to ensure that when I left, I would have complete, verified financial autonomy, securing my children's future without relying on any negotiated settlement. Leaving sooner would have risked that independence. Thorne shifted abruptly, opening a thick binder. "Let's discuss Dr. Ross's records, then. You state that Mr. Hayes undermined you. Yet, we have records showing you frequently reported feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt, and anxiety within the marriage. Isn't it more accurate to say, Mrs. Hayes, that you were struggling with pre-existing emotional difficulties, and you are now projecting that struggle onto Mr. Hayes?" The air grew heavy. This was the moment of maximum exposure, the attempt to invalidate her reality. Wendy looked directly at Thorne for the first time. His eyes were cold, waiting for the tremor. The documented symptoms of inadequacy and anxiety are clinical markers of the impact of systematic, sustained psychological abuse and gaslighting, Mr. Thorne, Wendy articulated, separating each syllable deliberately. They are not the cause of the conflict. They are the result of the documented pattern of abuse. Dr. Ross's records clearly establish the causal link between Mr. Hayes's behaviors, his interceptions, his public insults, his financial surveillance, and my resulting emotional distress. Thorne pressed hard, his voice rising in volume. But you permitted these behaviors. You testified that at the gala, when Mr. Hayes called you stupid, you did not correct him. You stood there, silent, and allowed him to demean you publicly. If you are this brilliant, highly compensated professional, why did you surrender your dignity in that moment, Mrs. Hayes? Was it because, deep down, perhaps he had a point, that in matters of high finance you are indeed out of your depth? The word stupid hung in the sterile air, weaponized again, this time by a legal proxy. It was a direct, explosive attempt to shatter her composure. Wendy felt a familiar hot flush climb her neck, but she crushed it instantly. She remembered Michael, Jenna, and Dr. Ross waiting for her protection. She leaned forward, resting her palms flat on the table. Mr. Thorne, my silence in that public moment was not a concession of ignorance, but the final, desperate act of emotional self-preservation of a woman who had spent 8 years trying to manage a partner's pathological need for control. Wendy explained, her voice dropping slightly, gaining intensity. It was the mechanism I used to avoid a far more violent confrontation later. The irony, which you seem keen to ignore, is that I had just traded on the exact yield curve information he was discussing. The financial facts are undisputed. My AUM is $4.8 billion. His insults were stupid. My competence is not up for negotiation. The court reporter's fingers were flying, capturing the exchange. Thorne was visibly annoyed that she had managed to reclaim the catalytic insult and redirect it into a statement of fact, without breaking her professional facade. He was looking for emotional instability. He was finding only icy, calculated resolve. The next few hours were an exhausting, relentless assault on her credibility, her mental state, and her motives. But Wendy remained impermeable. She never raised her voice. She never corrected his assumptions unnecessarily. She simply returned every hostile question to the documented facts. The records show the pattern. The SEC reports show my earnings. The board requires context. As the deposition stretched into the late afternoon, Thorne's frustration became palpable. He realized he was not getting the emotional soundbite he needed to justify the narrative of a manipulative, vengeful ex-wife. He was running out of time, and Linda, outside the room, was busy filing the protective motions. Fine, Mrs. Hayes, Thorne finally snapped, clearly exasperated. Let us discuss the board. He leaned over the table. Hayes Capital is hemorrhaging clients. Reputational damage is severe. Are you aware that your actions, your decision to air what should be private marital issues in the financial press, are directly responsible for threatening the stability of a 400-year-old financial institution? I am aware that the documented, systemic pattern of psychological abuse and professional interference committed by Gregory Hayes is the root cause of the firm's instability. Wendy corrected smoothly. My current action is providing the board with the necessary fiduciary context to address that threat. Linda intervened. Mr. Thorne, my client has been under interrogation for 7 hours. We need a break. Thorne stood up abruptly, the heavy silence of the room returning. We are done for the day, Mrs. Hayes. But understand this. We will continue this line of inquiry. We will find the weakness. You cannot maintain this facade of perfection indefinitely. Wendy gathered her papers, her hands steady, despite the internal tremor of exhaustion. The effort had been extraordinary. She had endured the systematic re-examination of her darkest moments, transforming 8 years of pain into 300 pages of unshakable testimony. As she and Linda walked out, Wendy felt a crushing fatigue, but also a deep sense of strategic victory. They had bought the time. Michael's job was safer. Dr. Ross's license was protected for now. But the fight was far from over. The deposition transcript, meticulously crafted by Thorne's team, would be sent to every board member that night. It was a strategic gamble. Her composure versus Thorne's narrative spin. She had presented the facts, but whether the powerful conservative board of Hayes Capital would prioritize documented abuse over the immediate financial comfort of their CEO, a man from old money, remained terrifyingly uncertain. Wendy had risked everything to protect the truth and her allies, and now she could only wait for the verdict of the powerful men who held her former husband's future, and, perhaps, her own, in their hands. The silence in the Hayes Capital boardroom was not the respectful quiet of expectation. It was the dense, pressurized atmosphere that precedes an economic collapse. Gregory Hayes, impeccably tailored even at 8 o'clock on a Friday morning, sat at the head of the colossal mahogany table, facing 11 of the most powerful, oldest, and least emotional men and women in global finance. They were the arbiters of the inherited legacy he had always taken for granted. Gregory had walked in expecting a stern lecture, perhaps a temporary reduction in authority, a strong recommendation for a 6-month public relations tour focused on philanthropy. He expected to leverage the shared history, the private golf course deals, the decades of Hayes' dominance. Instead, he met only the flat, opaque gaze of Robert Thorne, the chairman, whose face was a carefully maintained mask of regret that never quite reached his eyes. The board members had done their homework. They had not spent the night reading the 300 pages of Wendy's testimony, the details of psychological degradation, the calculated public diminishing of her professional worth, the clinical catalog of 8 years of slow emotional suffocation. The abuse was irrelevant to them, a distasteful piece of necessary paperwork. What they had read, with meticulous focus, was the real collateral damage report, the exponential rise of client redemptions in the past 72 hours. They had reviewed the market analysis predicting the Hayes stock price would continue to plummet with every new revelation Sarah Collins extracted. They had absorbed the memo from the General Counsel regarding the imminent and entirely winnable suit for breach of fiduciary duty due to his public conduct and the subsequent erosion of asset under management, a suit Wendy's legal team had expertly teed up but had not yet filed. They did not care about the moral injury. They cared about the monetary hemorrhage. Thorne cleared his throat, a small, dry sound that seemed to absorb all the air in the room. He did not look at Gregory, but at the polished surface of the table, where the reflection of the Manhattan skyline shimmered, distorted by the wood grain. "Gregory," Thorne began, his voice low and deliberate, "the board has reached a necessary, albeit painful conclusion regarding the immediate future of the firm. The decision is unanimous." Gregory felt a sudden cold sweat break out along his neck, chilling him despite the room's climate control. He instinctively gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. This was not the tone of a dressing down. This was the tone of a corporate execution. The discussion, though brief, was brutal in its clinical detachment. There was no confrontation, no opportunity for Gregory to deploy his accustomed charm or righteous indignation. Thorne articulated the decision using only legal and financial language, a shield against emotion. Gregory was informed, through a series of carefully worded clauses, that his continued presence as chief executive officer represented an irrevocable breach of the market's trust. The board cited reputational contamination and a demonstrable erosion of shareholder value precipitated by his recent widely publicized actions. He heard the words restructuring, interim leadership, and immediate removal of all management responsibilities. The vote had been carried, 11-0. When he finally tried to speak, the sound that came out was a strangled, high-pitched query, not the commanding baritone he reserved for the office. But, "It's my name. My family built this." Another board member, a woman who controlled a large pension fund and had remained silent through the entire ordeal, intervened with crisp, cutting, indirect dialogue. She stated, without preamble, that the firm's obligations were to its investors, not to lineage, and that the Hayes name, once a pillar of stability, was now a liability actively costing them hundreds of millions in redemptions daily. The truth, raw, earned, financial truth, struck Gregory like a physical blow. They were taking away his name, or rather, removing him from the mechanism that protected the name. The entire basis of his identity, the inherited wealth and power structure that had allowed him to dismiss Wendy for 8 years, was being systematically dismantled by the very instruments designed to protect it. He rose from the chair, a swift, violent motion that scraped the heavy wood back across the marble floor. His face was blotchy, a dangerous flush creeping up from his starched collar, replacing the cold sweat with a boiling, helpless rage. He did not shout obscenities. He did not threaten legal action. That would imply he was fighting the board on their terms. Instead, he simply looked at Thorne and the collective panel of judges with a look of pure, disbelieving aristocratic contempt. The look of a man who believed the rules applied to everyone except him. "You'll regret this," he managed, the 3 words spat out with the venom of a betrayed sovereign. Then, without waiting for the details of his severance package or the handoff of his corporate credentials, he stormed out of the boardroom. The sudden silence Gregory left behind was far louder than the explosion of his departure. The board immediately moved to stabilize the stock, already executing the pre-planned operational triage, having anticipated his reaction. Hayes Capital had survived its namesake. 2 hours later, Wendy was sitting in Linda Bennett's office, overlooking Central Park. She was drinking lukewarm coffee, waiting for a call that Linda had assured her would come before noon. Wendy's body was strung tight, the residual physical emotion of the deposition still lingering as a dull ache behind her eyes and across her shoulders. She was outwardly composed, dressed in a sharp dove-gray suit, but inside, she was vibrating with the anticipation of judgment. The phone rang precisely at 11:15. Linda picked up immediately, her voice switching instantly to her most professional, sterile tone. Wendy watched her attorney's eyes, the only barometer she trusted in this sterile environment, as she listened to the updates from her contacts inside Hayes Capital. Linda nodded slowly, a single, sharp dip of the chin. She offered no verbal cues, maintaining the necessary confidentiality, but the slight relaxation of her jaw and the way she straightened her spine provided the necessary indirect confirmation. When Linda finally hung up, she placed the phone gently back on its cradle. She did not offer a celebratory gesture or a triumphant smile, understanding the solemnity of the moment. "It's done, Wendy," Linda said quietly. The board removed him as CEO, effective immediately. They cited overwhelming financial imperative, massive client redemptions, and the ongoing media narrative. A single, involuntary tremor ran down Wendy's arms, causing her hands to twitch. It was not relief she felt, not yet. It was the physical manifestation of a massive weight, held taut for 8 years, finally snapping free. It was the calculated, perfect fulfillment of the plan. She had not only survived, she had used the very mechanisms of his power, finance and public perception, to neutralize him. "And the narrative?" Wendy asked, her voice steady. "The narrative is already shifting," Linda confirmed. "The wire services are running the story now. Hayes Capital is emphasizing leadership integrity, and unwavering commitment to client trust. They made him a sacrificial lamb to save the brand. He is currently unemployed and, by all accounts, completely unhinged. Wendy closed her eyes briefly, processing the implication. The corporate battle was won. Gregory Hayes was no longer the untouchable CEO of a billion-dollar firm. He was simply Gregory Hayes, a man whose public conduct had cost him his inheritance. But the corporate humiliation was only half the victory. The board had removed him, fulfilling the strategic exit requirement. Now came the final, most dangerous phase, the personal fallout. A man stripped of his perceived power, who operated solely through control and intimidation, was now loose in the world. The divorce settlement, Wendy stated, opening her eyes. He will fight it now. He will weaponize the personal fight. Linda nodded. He will. But we have already won the essential leverage. His reputation is non-existent. The board vote is leverage, and you, Wendy, are now clearly the financially superior party. He has lost his standing as the primary provider. Wendy stood up, moving towards the window. She looked out at the city, a landscape she now navigated as a victor, not a subject. The victory was immense, strategic, and definitive. She had engineered the downfall of a Goliath using only truth and market forces. But the cold calculation in her stomach told her one crucial thing. Gregory, humiliated and desperate, was now facing the end of his known world. He would not simply sign the papers. He would seek a final explosive confrontation. The war of wealth was over, but the war of control was about to turn ugly. She had achieved the victory that secured her autonomy. Yet the deep physical knot of anxiety remained, anticipating the desperate response of a wounded, entitled man who still believed she owed him dignity. The corporate collapse was the prelude to the final personal reckoning. The immediate aftermath of the board vote was not a celebration, but a strange, deep vacuum. The furious noise of the market, the relentless pinging of notifications detailing client redemptions, and the collective global gasp over the fall of the Hayes dynasty had all reached a fever pitch, only to collapse into an unnatural, heavy silence. Wendy did not feel elation. Elation implied a joyous surprise. This was not surprise. It was the execution of a 5-year plan built on cold projections and emotional zero tolerance. She felt the heavy geological settling of tectonic plates, an immense pressure released, replaced by the certainty of a new, stable crust. She was sequestered in a temporary anonymous apartment provided by Linda Bennett's firm, 30 floors above the cacophony of Midtown. It was a space designed for neutrality, devoid of history, which suited her perfectly. She spent the morning of the day following Gregory's forced resignation, reviewing the final proposed settlement terms. Her objective remained surgical: secure the children's stability and financial future, finalize the divorce without further delay, and maintain absolute emotional distance from Gregory's performance of contrition. The victory, she recognized, was not in humiliating him. That was a side effect of truth, but in making her financial position unassailable, ensuring he could never exert economic pressure again. The $2.4 million annual salary that had first stunned the public was already being dwarfed by the negotiations for her new role at BlackRock. But the current financial documents she held in her hands were the end-of-life paperwork for Hayes Capital Group, or at least the end of Gregory's control over it. Linda Bennett arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, carrying a burgundy leather satchel that seemed to weigh exactly as much as 8 years of buried resentment. Linda, always precise and measured, placed the documents on the glass table. "He is signing, Wendy," Linda stated, her voice crisp, bypassing the need for unnecessary legal jargon. It was an affirmation, not a query. Wendy looked up from a spreadsheet comparing the anticipated legal fees, now totaling $3.8 million, against the immediate liquidity from her personal investment portfolios. Her expression showed nothing but analytical concentration. "He knows," Wendy replied, referring not to the specific terms but to the inescapable reality of the situation. Dialogue subentendido. The implication was clear. Gregory was not signing because he agreed, but because failure to sign meant immediate, catastrophic financial ruin, including potential felony charges related to the misuse of corporate funds unearthed during the board's hasty investigation. Wendy had not exposed that for revenge, but as a strategic contingency. Linda nodded, understanding the subtext perfectly. The leverage is complete. The board installed a new CEO yesterday, an outside hire. They are moving rapidly to stabilize client capital. Gregory is completely isolated. He has two options: sign the agreement, offering him generous visitation rights, or fight the agreement and expose himself to a full discovery, which would involve the potential criminal charges and the formal acknowledgement of spousal abuse for the custody courts. He chose the path of least resistance for his reputation. He is performing the act of a good father to avoid the appearance of a failed businessman, Wendy summarized, leaning back. This was the core of Gregory's motivation. Control the narrative, even in defeat. Linda pushed a thin, certified packet across the table. This is the proposed script for the press conference he will hold tomorrow. It includes a statement acknowledging his cruelty, a specific mention of taking full responsibility for the failure of our marriage, and his immediate agreement to the terms specified. Wendy picked up the script. It was a sterile corporate apology designed by the same crisis PR firm that had once tried to scrub the viral video from the internet. She scanned the paragraphs where Gregory's voice was supposed to convey regret. The words felt hollow, like currency that had been rendered worthless. Contrasting description, she juxtaposed the clinical professionalism of the PR firm's language, words like unacceptable lapse in judgment and deep personal introspection, against the vivid memory of him grabbing her arm at the gala, whispering, "You are making us look stupid, Wendy." The gap between the public lie and the private truth was vast, a gulf she had successfully weaponized. "Does he believe any of it?" Wendy asked, her tone flat, observational. Linda didn't hesitate. "No. He believes he is being forced to lie to preserve his last vestiges of status and access to the children. But his feelings are irrelevant, Wendy. The agreement states he will sign on day 21. The legal framework was airtight. It delineated the primary physical custody granted to Wendy, the financial stipulations for the children's maintenance, calculated based on Gregory's future earning potential, not his current unemployment status, and, most critically, the complete and total surrender of any claim to the assets Wendy had accumulated independently, including her future compensation package. The sense of alleviation was profound, resting solely in these cold, unambiguous legal definitions. The 8-year burden of self-censorship, of suppressing her intellect to pacify his ego, was now officially codified as unnecessary. Recognition of change or loss. But in the legal victory, there was a subtle, sharp sting of loss. Wendy looked down at the documents detailing the division of their shared, non-liquid assets, the art collection, the Nantucket home. These items, once symbols of a perceived partnership and security, were now merely line items in a schedule of dissolution. She recognized that the woman who had married Gregory Hayes, hopeful and believing in his charm, was dead. She had been replaced by this methodical, unyielding strategist. The cost of dignity was not money. It was the 8 years spent in silence, calculated meticulously, hour by hour. Parallel action. While Linda organized the 4 separate copies of the final judgment, a stack nearly 2 inches thick, meticulously indexed and tabbed. Wendy walked to the window. Outside, the city was moving, relentless, uncaring about the individual dramas unfolding inside its towers. She saw a tiny flash of reflected sunlight from a window across the street, possibly the old Hayes Capital office. She had leveraged the market's morality, its demand for competence and ethical conduct, against Gregory's entitlement. She had proven that earned worth always superseded inherited wealth in the long run. "What about the final meeting?" Wendy finally asked, turning back to Linda. "Does he still insist on a private meeting immediately before the signing, as the script suggests?" Linda consulted her notes. "Yes, he requested 15 minutes, supervised, immediately following the press conference, but before the final signing ceremony. He phrased it as a courtesy to acknowledge the end of a long relationship. We strongly advise against it, Wendy. It is a calculated attempt to break your composure or, worse, make an emotional appeal to force a modification of terms." Wendy shook her head slowly. The anxiety knot in her stomach tightened, not out of fear, but anticipation. She knew this was the final reckoning she had sensed since the board meeting. Gregory needed to see her face, to try and reclaim the control he had lost by inflicting pain or doubt. "I will take the meeting," Wendy stated. Linda frowned, professionalism momentarily giving way to concern. "Wendy, there is no legal requirement." "No," Wendy interrupted gently, but firmly. "There is an emotional one. For him, he needs to witness the fact that I am not broken, not diminished, and that his greatest insult, calling me stupid, has been transformed into the greatest strategic advantage of my life. He needs to see the finality, face to face. Otherwise, he will always believe this was a temporary setback engineered by others, not a permanent consequence delivered by me." Linda, recognizing the strategic rather than emotional logic in Wendy's decision, simply secured the 4 sets of documents. "Very well. We will proceed with the 15-minute supervised mediation session immediately following the press conference tomorrow. Dr. Ross has agreed to be present as a silent observer. We will meet at the Family Court Administrative Offices downtown at 3 o'clock sharp. The signing is scheduled for 3:45. The legal maneuvering was over. The media frenzy was fading, replaced by the grim mechanics of corporate cleanup. What remained was the raw, personal moment of confrontation. Wendy accepted the determination that settled over her, chilling her nerves, but clarifying her focus. She had achieved acceptance. Acceptance that 8 years had been a battle waged in silence, and acceptance that the final bullet had to be fired at point-blank range, not across a crowded ballroom. She picked up a pen, signing off on the receipt of the 323 separate exhibits that formed the legal foundation of her freedom. Tomorrow, Gregory Hayes would perform his public apology. And then he would face the architect of his downfall, the woman he had underestimated for the last, quiet, dangerous time. The corporate war was settled. The personal one was about to conclude. The next morning, the televised apology was a performance executed with the stiff, brittle dignity of a statue melting under acidic rain. Gregory, dressed in a muted charcoal suit, spoke to a bank of cameras not as the victim of public scrutiny, but as the unwilling protagonist of a tragic misunderstanding. Wendy watched the feed from her sister Jasmine's living room, sipping lukewarm green tea. She saw the familiar practiced sorrow in the downturn of his lips, the calculated pause before he admitted his failures in judgment, and stress-induced lapses in respectful communication. He never used the words abuse or control. He referred to the 8 years of documented psychological demolition merely as a profound and regrettable imbalance in the marital power structure. It was the final, required step in the corporate cleanup, a carefully managed narrative aimed at minimizing future legal liability, not achieving true contrition. He is still managing the perception, not accepting the truth, Wendy thought, her focus hard and clear. Her emotion, usually a tightly leashed thing, was projected entirely outward, forming an invisible shield around her. She felt nothing for the man on the screen, only professional critique for the poor quality of his acting. The fragmented clips of the press conference, Gregory's forced humility, the quick flash of the Hayes Capital logo in the background, the relentless clicking of cameras, sounded like the final grinding gear of a colossal machine seizing up and dying. "It's done, Wen," Jasmine murmured, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The public narrative is set. He is the villain who apologized. You are the victor who deserved better." "The narrative is irrelevant now, Jazz," Wendy replied, standing up. "The only thing that matters is the signature." The final confrontation occurred not in a courtroom, but in the neutral, highly efficient conference room of Linda Bennett's law firm overlooking Central Park. The air conditioning was set too high, the polished mahogany table gleamed under recessed lights, and the atmosphere felt less like a legal meeting and more like a sterile operating theater where a difficult, necessary excision was about to take place. Gregory arrived alone, visibly deflated, wearing the same charcoal suit. The forced energy of the previous day's apology was gone, replaced by a sullen exhaustion that looked uncomfortably like genuine defeat. He had lost his title, his company was rebranding, and the financial press had spent 48 hours dissecting his performance, concluding that his contrition was too late and too thin. Linda Bennett, Wendy's attorney, sat at the head of the table, her presence radiating silent, absolute authority. Wendy sat opposite Gregory, placing the final packet of divorce documents between them. A thin, black volume containing the essence of her 3-year exit plan, now fully realized. Gregory looked at the papers, then up at Wendy, his eyes attempting to connect in the old way, the way that implied a secret, shared complexity that only they understood. "Wendy," he began, his voice low, intimate, a calculated return to the dynamics of the bedroom and the quiet dinner table, "I hope you know that despite everything, the board, the press, the stupid video, I still—" Linda cleared her throat, a sharp, decisive sound. Wendy looked directly into Gregory's eyes, her own holding steady, glacial. She interrupted him, not by raising her voice, but by utterly collapsing the emotional space he was trying to open. "Gregory," she said, her voice clear and without inflection, "the language of the decree is explicit. We are signing the judgment, confirming the custodial arrangements, and finalizing the distribution of assets as outlined in Schedule B. There is nothing left for discussion, and certainly nothing left for negotiation of sentiment." He flinched, recognizing the professional tone he had always sought to crush under the guise of wifely submission. "But what about us?" he pushed, attempting to anchor his fragile sense of self-worth to the wreckage of their past. "The 8 years? Can we really just erase that with a stroke of a pen? We built a life, Wendy. A successful one. Don't you think that deserves—" "It deserves legal resolution," Wendy cut him off, reaching for the pen. This wasn't dialogue. It was excision. She refused to let him weave the thread of shared history back into the tapestry of her future. "You had 8 years to value my contributions, Gregory. You chose contempt and control. Now, the cost of that choice is due." The sentence hung in the cold, still air. "The cost of that choice is due." He slumped back, realizing the door to emotional manipulation was locked, bolted, and bricked over. His final attempt at control had been rendered irrelevant by her unshakable calm. The signing was fragmented action. A quick scribble from Linda, a measured, steady signature from Wendy, then Gregory's hesitant, looping signature, scrawled across the documents as if he were trying to deny the weight of the paper beneath his hand. When Wendy signed the final page, Wendy Anderson, the pen did not feel like a simple instrument of ink and metal. It felt, metaphorically, like a welder's torch, severing the rusted chains of the past and simultaneously fusing the structural supports of her future. The 8 years of quiet endurance, the hidden accounts, the strategic client cultivation, the thousands of hours spent mastering the market while he was busy mastering her, it all coalesced into that single, irreversible moment. The identity she had worn, Hayes, dropped away like obsolete armor. Later that afternoon, the news of the finalized divorce was a quiet ripple compared to the tidal wave of the past 3 weeks. The headlines had moved on to the next corporate scandal, leaving the collapse of the Hayes marriage to settle into the historical record of cautionary tales. Wendy sat in her new office space, high above Midtown, facing a view of Manhattan that felt utterly untainted by Gregory's influence. She was no longer just the managing director of Hayes Capital. She was the newly appointed senior managing director at BlackRock, reporting directly to the executive committee. The employment contract sat on her desk, a salary base of $1.2 million, an immediate grant of equity that valued her stake at $2.5 million, and a guaranteed performance bonus structure that nudged her total compensation package to $4.2 million annually. She looked at the numbers, not with avarice, but with a deep, consuming sense of vindication. $4.2 million. The quantitative proof of her competence. Her financial net worth, the worth she had earned, cultivated, and protected, now dwarfed Gregory's liquid assets, which were tied up in the messy unwinding of his former empire. She thought back to the Plaza Hotel, the sound of the glass clinking, the hot, public humiliation of the word stupid. It had been the catalyst, the single, accidental spark that ignited the methodical, professional arsenal she had spent years building in silence. The true currency, she realized, was not the inherited $1 billion Gregory had used as a pedestal for arrogance. It was the earned dollars, the merit-based compensation, the market's objective validation of her intellectual capacity and strategic depth. Inherited wealth could sustain entitlement. Earned wealth secured autonomy. The transformation was complete. It wasn't just the divorce decree or the job title, it was the quiet internal certainty that she was finally, irrevocably free of the burden of performing smallness. Wendy picked up her work phone, the very same device she had used for years to secretly manage her exit plan. She dialed a number she hadn't used in months, the number for Dr. Helen Ross, the marriage counselor who had documented the pattern of abuse. "Dr. Ross? It's Wendy Anderson. I just wanted to call and thank you. Everything is finalized. The decree is signed." "Ms. Anderson, I am so pleased to hear that," Dr. Ross replied, her voice warm and professional. "I remember when I first came to you," Wendy continued, looking out at the vast skyline. "I felt trapped behind glass, suffocating. I thought the only way out was to shatter myself and everything around me. And what did you find instead?" Wendy smiled, a genuine, expansive smile that reached her eyes. "I found that I didn't need to shatter anything. I just needed to locate the keys I already held," she concluded. "And I discovered that the world will always pay a far higher price for proven competence than it will for inherited pretension." She hung up, the weight of 8 years finally lifting entirely. There was no bitterness, only the profound, cleansing sensation of completeness. The financial markets were ruthless, but they were also honest. They did not care about family names or inherited titles. They cared only about results. And Wendy Anderson had delivered. The fight was over, the battle won, and the new structure of her life, built entirely on her own foundation, stood firm, ready for the future.